Rancher lived alone for years until the Bigfoot dragged a mysterious woman from a cave. For 7 winters the old rancher lived alone, no voice but the wind across his fences. But one dawn the mountains trembled. From the dark mouth of a cave came a roar, and a shadow too big to be real. He froze, watching that creature drag a woman through the snow. Her hair tangled her body weak, yet her eyes still alive. He ran to her, covering her with his coat. "Don't let it take me back," she whispered. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. He lifted her onto his horse, staring toward the cave. "If it comes for her," he said softly, "it'll have to go through me." Snow fell. The wind went quiet, and the Wild West held its breath. The roar from the dark cave. The winter of 1885 had settled deep over the western plains. Snow stretched as far as the eye could see, swallowing every sound except the wind. And in the middle of that silence stood a small wooden ranch, half buried in frost, a lonely outpost, and the only home left to Elias Gray. For 7 years he had spoken to no one but his horse and the cattle that roamed the fences. Each dawn began the same, the cold breath of the prairie, the crunch of boots on ice, and the memory of his wife sleeping forever beneath the hill behind the barn. He had learned to live without warmth until that morning. At first it came as a whisper, a low vibration rolling down from the northern mountains. Then another, deeper, angrier. The earth trembled. Birds scattered from the trees. Elias froze, his gloved hands tightening on the reins. No wolf howled like that. No bear could make the ground shake. He'd heard tales of the Devil's Hollow, a cave hidden beyond the ridge where hunters vanished and hoofprints stopped mid-snow. Most men stayed away, but Elias had nothing left to lose. He rode out through the storm, the wind biting his face raw. Each gust carried that dreadful growl closer, until even the horse began to shudder beneath him. From the ridge he saw it, a dark shape moving through the blizzard, taller than any man, broader than any beast. It dragged something behind it, something small, limp, and human. For a moment, the world stopped. Elias's breath caught. The creature vanished into the pines, leaving behind a trail of blood and a pale arm resting motionless in the snow. Fear rooted him in place, but compassion broke it loose. His heart, long buried under years of silence, began to beat again. And for the first time in 7 winters, Elias whispered a prayer not for himself, but for whoever she was. Part 1. The Woman in the Snow. The wind was howling through the broken pines when Elias reached the mouth of the cave. Snow whirled in great blinding sheets, each flake sharp as glass against his face. The horse beneath him snorted, stamping nervously, its breath rising in white clouds that vanished into the dark. Elias could still hear the echo of the roar, fainter now, fading into the distance, but his eyes stayed fixed on the shape sprawled in the snow just ahead. For a moment he thought it might be another carcass the winter had claimed, some traveler who'd wandered too far into the high country. But when he dismounted and knelt beside the figure, the sight stole the breath from his chest. It was a woman. Her hair, long tangled, crusted with ice, spread across the snow like a dark halo. Her dress was torn, soaked through the color, impossible to tell beneath the frost. He brushed a trembling hand against her cheek. Cold, but not the stillness of death. There was softness beneath the chill, a hint of warmth hidden deep inside. "Dear Lord," he whispered, leaning closer. He pressed his ear to her chest. For one terrible second there was nothing but the hiss of wind and his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then faint, almost imagined a flutter, one small, stubborn beat. Elias exhaled the sound, shaking like the storm itself. "You're alive." He slid his arms beneath her body, careful as if she might break apart, and lifted her from the snow. She was light, too light, and her skin burned his through the wet of his gloves. Behind him the horse shifted uneasy, but Elias spoke softly, calming it the same way he would a frightened colt. "Easy now, old friend. Easy." When he turned to mount, her hand moved, just barely. A twitch at first, then her fingers found his wrist and closed weakly around it. Elias froze. The touch was feather-light, yet it stopped him as surely as a bullet. 7 years. 7 winters without the warmth of another human soul. and now this faint pulse of life trembling against his skin. His throat tightened. He looked down at her face, pale lashes dusted with frost, lips blue but not lifeless. "I've got you," he murmured. "You're safe." He lifted her onto the horse, wrapping his coat around her shoulders, pulling the lapels tight. The smell of leather and smoke surrounded them both. With one arm he held her steady, the other gripping the reins. Then he turned the horse toward the valley and urged it forward through the snow. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of wind and white. The storm thickened, erasing sky from earth. Elias could barely see the outline of the next ridge. He kept his head low, guiding by memory the slope of the land, the line of the creek half buried under ice. Every few minutes he looked down at her, watching for the small rise and fall of her breath. Each time he saw it, a spark of something old and forgotten stirred inside him. Hope. By the time the cabin came into view, a faint yellow glow bleeding through the snow. His arms were numb, his legs stiff. He dismounted, cradling the woman once more, and kicked open the door with his boot. The room filled with the smell of cold air and wood smoke. He laid her gently on the bed, the same bed he'd once shared with his wife, and for an instant the ghosts of memory swept through him like dust in sunlight. He pushed them away. The fire had nearly died. He crouched beside the hearth, fed it kindling, and blew until flames leapt high and gold. Then he turned back to the woman. Her clothes were soaked through. He could see the tremor of her breath slowing. Elias hesitated only a heartbeat before fetching the old quilt from the chest at the foot of the bed, the one his wife had sewn years ago, faded now, but still warm. He wrapped it around the stranger and pulled the chair close to keep watch. Hours passed. Outside, the wind screamed across the plain, rattling the shutters. Inside, only the crackle of fire and the soft, fragile sound of her breathing. Elias sat unmoving, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. Questions turned over and over in his mind. Who was she? How had she ended up in that cursed cave? And why, of all people, had she lived long enough for him to find her? When her eyelids fluttered at last, Elias nearly dropped the mug he was holding. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then catching the firelight gray like the sky before snow. She looked around the room, confusion tightening her features. "Where am I?" The words came rough broken. "Safe," Elias answered. "You're in my cabin." She tried to sit, but pain crossed her face and she sank back into the pillow. "The cave," she whispered. "Did you see it?" Elias nodded. "I saw enough." Her gaze darted toward the door as if the darkness outside could hear them. "It's still out there," she said. "It never stops watching." He didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to. He'd seen the thing with his own eyes, and no amount of whiskey or prayer could convince him otherwise. "You need rest," he told her. "It won't get near this place tonight." Her eyes searched his face for a long time. Maybe she saw the lines that grief had carved there, or the steadiness in his voice that he himself didn't feel. Then her lashes lowered again, and she slipped back into sleep. Elias sat back, the chair creaking under his weight. The fire painted shadows across the walls, shadows that moved like memories. He thought about the hand that had clutched his wrist, the fragile strength in it. Somewhere beneath the ache of old loneliness, he felt a strange sense of purpose settling in. Protecting her gave him reason to breathe again. The storm raged on. Once he thought he heard a sound beyond the wind, a heavy footstep in the snow, too slow and deliberate to be the weather's trick. He rose, crossed to the window, and peered out. Darkness pressed against the glass. Nothing moved but the swirling snow. Still he reached for the rifle hanging by the door. Hours blurred into morning. The storm spent itself at last, leaving a silence so deep it seemed the world was holding its breath. Elias brewed coffee, the bitter scent filling the room. When he turned, he found her awake again, propped on one elbow, watching him. "Name's Elias," he said, pouring a cup. "Elias Gray." She nodded faintly. "Mara," she said. "My name is Mara." The sound of it was soft, fragile as the wind through dry grass. They sat in quiet for a while, the fire snapping between them. She sipped the coffee with shaking hands, and color began to creep back into her cheeks. Outside, light spilled over the plains, turning the snow to silver. Elias steadied her without meaning to. The bruises along her arms, the raw scrape at her temple, the torn hem of her dress. Whatever had happened to her out there, it had been more than a night's misfortune. And yet beneath the exhaustion there was strength, something unbroken, that refused to die. When she noticed his gaze, she smiled faintly, almost shy. "You saved me," she said. Elias looked down at his hands, rough and cracked. "Guess we both needed savin'," he muttered. Her smile lingered small but real. It warmed the room more than the fire did. The rest of the day passed quietly. Elias mended a broken shutter, chopped wood, kept busy the way lonely men do when they don't want to think. Each time he glanced inside, he saw her sitting by the window, wrapped in his coat, staring out at the endless white. Sometimes her lips moved, whispering words he couldn't hear, maybe prayers, maybe memories. As dusk fell, the cabin grew dim. Elias lit the lantern, and the glow wrapped around them like a cocoon against the dark. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world looked peaceful, almost kind. But deep in the pines, something shifted, a faint echo of movement, heavy and patient. Mara stirred. "You hear that?" Elias set down his tools. The sound came again, a low crunch of footsteps circling the cabin. Not wind, not imagination. He moved to the window, eyes narrowing. Nothing but shadows and trees. Then between two trunks he caught a glimpse, a flash of movement, tall and silent. "It's come back," Mara breathed. Elias turned to her, the rifle already in his hand. "Stay close to the fire," he said. "If it wants you, it'll have to go through me first." Her eyes met his, wide and terrified, yet trust flickered there too. For a man who had lived 7 years in silence, that look said more than any prayer. Outside, the wind began to rise again, sweeping over the drifts, carrying with it the faintest sound of a growl, the kind that lives between nightmares and truth. Elias stood at the door, listening, feeling the weight of the rifle, the weight of duty, the weight of another heart beating just a few feet behind him. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone, and for reasons he couldn't explain that frightened him more than the creature in the snow. He stayed there until the growl faded, until the night went still. Only then did he lower the gun and glance back. Mara had fallen asleep again, her face peaceful in the firelight. Elias watched her a long time, the corners of his mouth softening. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying secrets, older than any man. But inside that small cabin, 2 souls, one broken, one barely alive, shared the same fragile warmth while the winter waited outside. And as the last flame flickered low, Elias realized that in saving her, he had unknowingly saved a part of himself. Part 2. The cabin in the wind night pressed hard against the cabin walls, thick with snow and silence. The storm had passed, but the wind lingered like a restless ghost, slipping through every crack in the old wood. Inside, the fire burned low, its glow trembling across the walls, throwing long shadows that swayed and disappeared. Elias sat by the hearth, sleeves rolled, tending the bandage wrapped around the woman's arm. The gash wasn't deep, but it told a story, one she could not yet speak. Her skin was bruised where rope had cut at faint marks circling her wrists. He worked slowly, steady hands despite the tremor of fatigue in them. Steam rose from the pot of hot water beside him. The scent of pine resin filled the air where he'd mixed it with crushed herbs. Mara watched him through half-open eyes. Every movement he made was deliberate, careful, as though she were something fragile pulled from the edge of breaking. "You should rest," he said quietly, voice rough from disuse. "I slept enough in that darkness," she murmured, gaze drifting toward the window. Snow tapped against the glass like fingers. Elias tightened the bandage and sat back, his chair creaking. The light of the fire drew the lines on his face into deeper relief, the hollow under the eyes, the silver in his beard, the heaviness of solitude. "You remember anything else?" She shook her head. "Just my name. Mara. Everything else is fog. I remember cold, chains, the sound of breathing that wasn't mine." Her voice caught and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Elias looked away, giving her the grace of silence. He poured her another cup of broth and passed it to her. She took it with both hands, letting the warmth soak into her fingers. "Out there," she said after a while, "did you see its eyes?" He nodded slowly. "Yellow, like a wolf's but higher than any man's head." Her shoulders tightened. "It watches," she whispered, "even when you think it's gone." Elias poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "It won't come near tonight," he said. "Not while there's light." But when he glanced toward the window, he noticed his reflection trembling against the glass, and beyond it the forest still and deep like a sea of black waves. He wondered how many things could hide inside that darkness. They spoke little after that. The wind did most of the talking, moaning through the trees, rattling the tin kettle that hung above the stove. The rhythm of it became almost human, a voice too low to name. Elias sat with the rifle across his knees, listening to every creak. Mara lay beneath the quilt, her breathing steadying. Every so often she stirred, eyes fluttering as though she were running in her dreams. At some forgotten hour past midnight, Elias dozed in the chair. A sound pulled him awake, not the wind this time, but a slow, deliberate crunch of snow outside. One step, then another. He rose without a word, the floorboards complaining softly. The fire had dwindled to embers, leaving the room bathed in a dull red light. Through the window, he could see only the faint shimmer of the snowfield and the dark tree line. The sound came again, circling the cabin. Mara's voice, faint and trembling Elias. He motioned for silence. The footsteps stopped. The stillness that followed was worse. It was the silence of something listening. Then from the far side of the house, a scraping noise like claws dragging across wood. Mara gasped. Elias snatched the rifle, heart hammering. He moved to the door, every sense straining. "Stay by the fire," he whispered. She shook her head, sitting up. "Don't go out there. I have to." He eased the latch open, letting a slice of moonlight spill in. The cold bit deep, the air sharp enough to sting his eyes. Outside, nothing moved, only the endless white plain and the whisper of wind threading through pine. But along the wall of the cabin he saw prints, wide, heavy, pressed deep into the snow. They circled the cabin once, then vanished into the trees. When he came back in, Mara was standing by the hearth, wrapped in the quilt. She was shaking, though the fire had flared bright again. "It was here," she said. "I felt it." He set the rifle aside and closed the door. "It's gone now." She looked at him with eyes wide as the firelight. "If it comes back," she stopped herself, swallowed hard. "If it comes back, will you leave me?" Elias froze. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hiss of sap in the flames. Her question reached deeper than fear. It touched that hollow place in him that had stayed empty since the day he'd buried his wife. He crossed the small space between them. "No," he said, steady and low. "I've lost someone before. I won't lose another." Something in her face softened like a knot loosening. She nodded once, then let out a breath she'd been holding. The firelight caught the tears along her lashes, turning them into sparks. They sat together until the wind quieted. Elias added wood to the fire. Mara leaned against the wall, her eyes growing heavy. When she finally slept, he remained awake, watching the flames move across her face. The fear in her had not vanished. It had simply folded itself into exhaustion. But beneath that, he saw trust beginning to take shape, fragile as a thawing branch. By morning, the storm clouds had broken apart. Light poured through the window, pale and cold. Elias stepped outside to fetch water. The world glittered, every branch coated in ice, every drift untouched except for the deep tracks that led away into the woods. He followed them with his eyes until they disappeared into distance. Inside, Mara was awake, standing by the window, wrapped in his coat. She turned when he entered, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "I thought maybe you'd gone," she said. "Not likely," he answered, hanging his hat by the door. "You hungry?" She nodded. Together, they prepared breakfast, simple, quiet work that filled the cabin with the smell of coffee and cornmeal. For the first time since she'd arrived, laughter brushed the edge of her voice when she spilled some flour on the floor. Elias caught himself smiling back, surprised at how easily it came. The hours slipped by. She asked about his life here, about the horses, the valley, the long winters. He told her pieces, small ones. She listened with a softness that reminded him of spring after a long freeze, and though neither spoke it aloud, they both knew the silence outside still held something waiting. When dusk returned, Elias fixed the lantern and checked the rifle again. Mara watched him. "You think it will come back tonight? I don't think it ever left," he said. She wrapped the quilt tighter. "It wants me. Then it'll have to come through me first." Her eyes met his gray, meeting gray. A flicker of warmth passed between them, quiet but undeniable. She looked down, fingers clutching the edge of the quilt, and he felt the faint echo of that moment when her hand had first gripped his wrist. The same current moved between them, now stronger, alive. Night deepened. The fire crackled. Somewhere far off an owl called once, then fell silent. The world outside seemed to hold its breath again. Elias sat back in his chair, Mara beside the hearth. The glow touched her face, painting her hair in shades of copper and gold. "How long have you lived here alone?" she asked. "Too long. And your wife?" He hesitated, staring into the fire. "She died when the fever swept through the valley. After that, there wasn't much left to say to anyone." Mara was quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, "You keep her close still. I can see it." He looked at her, and something like gratitude crossed his face. "I reckon she'd want me to keep going." Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing snow from the roof in soft cascades. Mara rose, moved to the window, and stared into the white. "Do you think it can find us here?" "It already has," Elias said. "But we'll be ready." She turned back toward him. The fear that had ruled her since that cave seemed to waver. In its place grew something quieter, trust maybe, or the beginning of belief that she might live through the night. Later, as she lay beneath the quilt, Elias took the chair again. The firelight dwindled to embers, and shadows filled the room. From the edge of sleep, she whispered, "Elias, thank you." He answered without looking up, "Rest now." Outside, the wind howled through the pines, a long, mournful sound that might have been only weather or the creature calling her name. But inside the cabin, warmth clung stubbornly to the air, and two hearts beat in rhythm with the fire's slow pulse. Elias stayed awake long after she drifted into dreams. He listened for footsteps that did not come, for roars that stayed swallowed by the night. Every time the wind rose, he gripped the rifle tighter, but each time when it faded again, he let himself breathe. By dawn, exhaustion took him. The last thing he saw before sleep claimed him was Mara's face in the soft glow of the dying fire, alive, peaceful, untouched by the darkness beyond the walls. And as he drifted under, a thought crossed his mind, simple and startling in its truth. Maybe the world hadn't given him a reason to hope again. Maybe it had sent one instead. Part 3. The Giant Footprints. Morning came slow, dragging a pale light across the mountains. The storm had stopped some time before dawn, but the world it left behind felt changed, too still, too quiet. The snow lay untouched except for one terrible thing, the prints. Enormous round depressions pressed deep into the white, circling the cabin like a predator measuring its cage. Elias stepped out with his rifle slung low and his breath a ghost in the air. Each print was wider than his chest, the edges frozen hard. The horse wouldn't come near them. It stood tethered by the fence ears, flat, snorting clouds of fear. He crouched beside the nearest track and placed his palm inside it. His whole hand vanished in the hollow. No dream, he thought, no legend. Behind him the door creaked. Mara's voice floated out small and raw. "It was here, wasn't it?" Elias didn't turn. "Aye," he said, "and close." She wrapped the quilt tighter around her shoulders, the fabric brushing the threshold. "I told you it watches," she whispered. "It never really leaves." "Go back inside," Elias said. "Keep the fire high." When she hesitated, he added more gently, "I won't go far. Just need to see how far these prints run." The wind caught her hair, scattering strands across her face. She nodded once and closed the door. The sound of the latch falling into place seemed louder than it should have. Elias followed the tracks into the trees. The snow glared so bright it made his eyes ache. Each step he took sank to the knee, the crust breaking beneath his boots. The prints led north, winding through pines split by the storm. He counted 10, 20, 30 strides, and still they continued steady and deliberate. Somewhere in the distance a crow called the sound harsh against the hush. Elias's heart thudded slow and heavy. The air smelled of sap and iron. When he reached the clearing near the creek, he saw the first sign: a scrap of cloth snagged on a branch. It was blue once, now faded and stiff with frost. He pulled it free, turned it over in his hands, and realized it was part of a woman's dress. Not Mara's. Another. He scanned the ground and saw more. Bits of fabric scattered like shed skin and half buried in the snow, a shape that wasn't wood or stone. He brushed the snow away and felt the resistance of bone. A rib. Another beside it. The rest of the body lost to time and winter. For a long moment he stood there, the wind lifting his coat, the rifle heavy in his grip. The stories from town came back: hunters who vanished, a trapper found torn apart years ago, prints so large no bear could make them. He'd always dismissed them as frontier talk, whiskey, and loneliness. Now the truth stared up at him from the snow. Bigfoot. The name seemed childish, suddenly too small for the thing that left bones behind. A sound broke the stillness, branches shifting somewhere deeper in the trees. Elias spun, rifle raised. "Who's there?" he shouted. Nothing. Only the slow fall of snow from the boughs. He waited a full minute before lowering the gun. The forest answered with silence, so complete it made his ears ring. He swallowed, tasting metal. The tracks ahead turned east, back toward the ridge, but another line cut across them, smaller, lighter, fresher. Boots. His boots. The ones that had brought him here. He realized he'd been walking in a circle. Something clever was leading him away from the cabin. Elias's stomach tightened. He started back the way he'd come, pushing harder through the drifts, the wind rising around him. Every few yards he looked over his shoulder. The forest seemed to move when he didn't, breathing in time with him. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, relief hit him like warmth after frostbite. Smoke curled from the chimney. The roof glimmered with fresh snow. For a second he thought maybe everything was fine, that Mara was safe by the fire as he'd left her. Then he saw it, the trail, a dark ribbon cutting through the white, starting from the tree line and winding straight to his door. Blood. Fresh, bright, unfreezing. Elias broke into a run. "Mara!" he shouted, boots slamming against the ground. The rifle bounced against his back. Mara, no answer. Only the moan of wind. His breath came ragged, turning to steam. The trail thickened near the porch, splattered across the steps. He slammed through the door. The fire still burned. The chair was overturned. On the floor a cup lay, shattered, its contents bleeding into the boards. "Mara!" he roared again, voice cracking. From somewhere behind the cabin came a faint cry, muffled, distant. Elias bolted toward it, past the bed, through the storage room, out the rear door that led to the shed. Snow blinded him, but he saw motion, something dragging, something heavy moving through the pines. The shape was massive, hunched, almost invisible in the stormlight. "Mara!" he shouted again, and this time he heard her clearly. "Elias." The sound froze him mid-stride. He could hear her, but not see her. The creature's shadow passed between them, vast and silent. He fired once, the gunshot splitting the morning open. The echo rolled through the valley. Birds exploded from the trees. The shadow moved faster, retreating toward the ridge. Elias reloaded, running after it. "Hold on, Mara." His boots slipped, catching roots, tearing through drifts. The air tore at his lungs. Blood drops marked the snow. Hers, he knew it as sure as breath. Each crimson fleck was a lash across his heart, driving him faster. Branches whipped his face. He stumbled, caught himself, kept going. The tracks veered left into thicker woods where the light died. He followed, panting, muttering prayers he hadn't spoken in years. "Please, God, not again. Don't take her too." Then movement ahead. He caught a glimpse of her dress, the same pale cloth fluttering behind a trunk. He surged forward and nearly fell when she stumbled out of the trees herself, wild-eyed, breath smoking. "It's gone," she gasped. "It dropped me, just ran." Elias caught her before she collapsed. He pulled her close, feeling the tremors rattle through her body. "You hurt." She shook her head, clinging to his coat. "No." "But it wanted me to scream. It wanted you to follow." He looked back through the woods where the tracks twisted like wounds in the snow. The realization hit him hard. It's hunting both of us. They stood there, breathing each other's fear, until the cold bit too deep to linger. Elias half carried her back toward the cabin, every step cautious. The forest seemed alive now, each crack of ice a whisper, each gust of wind a warning. When they reached the clearing, he saw what he hadn't noticed before. The prints no longer ended at the cabin. They began there, circling outward as if something had been waiting all along. Inside, the fire was dying again. He shut the door, slid the bolt, and leaned his weight against it, chest heaving. Mara sank into the chair by the hearth face, pale. He knelt beside her, wiped the blood from her cheek with the edge of his sleeve. "It wanted me to see," he said quietly. "Those bones out there, the cloth. It's been here for years." Mara stared into the flames. "It's angry," she whispered. "I wasn't the first." Elias placed a hand on her shoulder. "You won't be the last either, not if I have anything to say about it." For the first time since dawn, she met his eyes. Whatever strength she had left gathered there. "You can't fight it," she said. "Maybe not," he answered, voice steady. "But I can make sure it remembers me." He stoked the fire high, feeding it until the cabin glowed. The flames reflected in her eyes like twin suns rising. Outside, the wind screamed anew, scattering the tracks he had followed, burying the bones, the cloth, the proof of everything. But he knew, and knowing changed him. That night, sleep wouldn't come. He sat in the chair with the rifle across his knees, watching the window where frost crept like veins. Mara dozed near the fire, her face soft, unguarded. The light danced over her, and he thought of how easily warmth could vanish in this world. He replayed the morning in his mind, the bones, the blood, the look in her eyes when she'd seen him burst through the trees. Terror, yes, but something else too. Trust, the kind that binds two people not by words, but by the promise to keep each other alive. Outside, the storm began again. Wind pressed against the walls, moaning through the chimney. Elias raised his head, listening. Beneath the storm's voice, another sound moved, a low, deliberate thud. Step. Pause. Step. Circling once more. He reached for the lantern and dimmed it until only embers glowed. The room filled with shadows. "It's back," he whispered. Mara stirred, eyes opening. "Elias." He motioned her to stay silent, finger to lips. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A long breath of wind sighed through the cracks, carrying with it a smell of damp fur and earth. Something brushed against the wall, heavy enough to make the boards creak. Elias gripped the rifle tighter. His pulse thundered. He could feel her behind him, close enough that he sensed the tremble of her breath. For one fragile instant, the cabin felt smaller than a coffin. Then the sound moved away slowly like retreating waves and was gone. Only the wind remained, echoing its ghost through the valley. Elias lowered the rifle, muscles shaking. He turned to her. "It's testing us," he said, "seeing how long before we break." Mara nodded, tears shining but unshed. "Then we don't break," she whispered. He looked at her for a long moment, then reached out, resting a calloused hand over hers. The world outside might be ruled by monsters, by cold and hunger, by ghosts in the trees, but inside that cabin, in that fragile touch, was something the creature could never understand. The first ember of defiance. And as the fire rebuilt itself from the ashes, Elias swore silently that he would not run again. Not from the dark, not from his past, not from the thing that haunted the snow. The hunt had begun, and this time he meant to finish it. Part 4. Inside the Devil's Cave. The mountain loomed black against a sky bruised with storm. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, whispering down like ash. Elias could see the tracks again, massive, deep, and fresh. They led straight toward the mouth of the Devil's Hollow. He had followed them since dawn, driven by a single thought that drowned out pain and fear. Alike Mara. The night before, she had been gone when he woke. Her blanket tossed aside, the door open to the storm. He knew even before he saw the trail of prints leading north that the creature had come for her. Now the cave rose before him like the open mouth of hell. Steam curled out of it, thick and sour, smelling of rot and earth, and something older than either. He tied the horse to a bare tree, grabbed the torch he'd made from a branch wrapped in oilcloth, and lit it from his last lantern. The flames sputtered, then flared to life, casting its glow on the ice that crusted the cave walls. "Hang on, Mara," he whispered, stepping into the dark. The sound inside swallowed everything. His boots splashed through shallow pools. Water dripped from above in slow, echoing taps. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, an unnatural cold that clawed at the lungs and stiffened his fingers. The torchlight trembled with every breath of wind that seeped from the stone. He reached a bend where the tunnel opened into a wide chamber. The air thickened heavy with the stench of old blood. Bones littered the ground animal, and human alike gnawed clean. Elias's stomach twisted, but he moved forward, each step sinking into the muck. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the cave, a faint rhythmic clinking like metal against stone. Chains. He raised the torch. At first the light caught nothing but rough walls. Then it shifted, and there she was, Mara shackled to a pillar of rock, her head bowed, her dress torn. Her wrists bled where the iron bit into them. Mara. The word tore out of him before he could stop it. Her head jerked up. Elias. Her voice cracked, disbelief and fear tangled together. He ran to her, cutting his hand on the jagged rock as he went. The chains were thick, rusted, but strong. He dropped the torch beside them and pulled at the metal until his palms bled. "Hold on," he said. "I'll get you out." From the darkness beyond the torchlight came a low growl, rising like thunder from deep earth. Mara's eyes went wide. "It's here," she whispered. Elias spun just as the shadow moved. The thing stepped into the firelight. Massive, hunched, its fur matted with mud and blood, its yellow eyes burning. It was man-shaped only in cruelty, too tall, too thick arms like tree trunks ending in claws. The smell hit him, rot fur death. Elias raised his rifle and fired. The blast exploded through the chamber, echoing until it felt like the world itself was collapsing. The bullet struck the beast in the shoulder. It howled the sound, shaking the cave, and charged. Elias barely rolled aside. Its fist smashed into the rock where he'd stood, splintering stone like kindling. He fired again, missed, and the creature swatted him like a doll. He hit the ground, hard pain shattering through his ribs. The torch tumbled, scattering sparks. Mara screamed, straining against her chains. He forced himself up, coughing blood, and grabbed the torch. "Come on, you bastard," he rasped. The beast turned its eyes, catching the flame. Elias swung the torch wide, the fire throwing shadows across the walls. The creature hesitated, stepping back, snarling. "That's right," Elias growled. "You don't like fire, do you?" He took a slow step forward, then another. He needed to drive it deeper into the tunnels, away from her. "Come on," he whispered, voice low and steady. "Come get me." The beast lunged, claws flashing. Elias threw the torch into its face and dove aside. The creature roared, blinded by the fire thrashing against the walls. Flames caught in its fur, smoking. Elias used the moment to scramble back to Mara. Her wrists were raw, her breath shallow. "You have to go," she said. "You can't fight it." He ignored her, pulling the hunting knife from his belt. The blade bit through the rusted chain link by link, the metal shrieking. Behind them, the beast tore at the rock, bellowing in rage. Elias could feel the heat from the flames dying. Almost there, he muttered, sawing faster. The last link snapped. Mara fell forward into his arms, her body shaking. "Run," he said, pulling her up. They stumbled toward the tunnel. Behind them, the growl deepened again. The fire had gone out. The darkness came alive. It hit before they reached the exit. One sweeping blow caught Elias across the back, throwing him forward. He landed hard, the rifle spinning out of reach. Pain burst behind his eyes, his breath stolen clean. He rolled over just in time to see the beast charging again, eyes burning through the dark. He reached for the torch, now nothing but a glowing stick, and thrust it forward. The beast slammed into him. The world went white, then red. He felt himself lifted, thrown against the wall. Bones cracked. He couldn't breathe. Mara screamed his name. The sound pierced through the haze. He forced his eyes open, saw her scrambling for the fallen rifle, saw the creature between them. "Run!" he shouted. "Go!" But she didn't run. She grabbed the gun, turned, and fired. The recoil nearly threw her down, but the shot struck true into the creature's neck. It staggered, roared, then backhanded her across the floor. Something inside Elias broke loose. He pushed off the wall pane, screaming through every nerve, and charged. He hit the creature with everything he had left, driving the glowing stick into its chest. Fire flared for one blinding instant. The beast howled, stumbled, and fell back into the pit from which it had come. Elias collapsed beside Mara. The cave shook with its dying roars. Dust fell from the ceiling. He could hear his own heartbeat loud and fast, the sound of a man still clinging to life by threads. Mara crawled to him, her hands finding the wound at his side. Blood welled between her fingers. "No," she whispered, voice breaking. "You can't die, not for me." He tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough. "Not for you," he said, his voice barely air. "For me. Needed a reason to live again." Her tears fell onto his face, hot against the cold. She pressed his hand slick with his own blood against her chest. "Don't leave me," she begged. "Please." He looked up at her, the torchlight flickering in her eyes. For the first time since his wife's death, he smiled. Not the empty kind, but the kind that comes when a man finally understands the weight he's carried all his life. Outside, thunder rolled over the peaks, distant and low. The cave trembled once more, stones loosening from above. "We have to move," she said, voice trembling. He nodded weakly. "Help me up." Together they staggered toward the mouth of the cave. The air grew warmer, lighter. Behind them the darkness groaned as if mourning its loss. When they reached the edge, Elias stumbled, and she caught him, his arm heavy over her shoulders. Snow blew into the cave, swirling around them. He looked back one last time. The creature's body burned in the pit flames, licking high, painting the walls red. "Stay there," he whispered to it. "Stay buried." Then they stepped into the daylight. The snow was falling again, soft and slow. Each flake caught in Mara's hair, melting as it touched her skin. They moved down the slope in silence, their breaths mingling in the cold. Elias's strength waned with every step, but he refused to stop. Not until he saw the cabin again, their single light in an endless wilderness. When they reached it, Mara lowered him gently onto the bed, tearing strips from her dress to bind his side. "You're bleeding too much," she said, her voice shaking. "Been worse," he murmured, though his skin was pale, lips fading. Fire scared it. "That's something." She pressed her forehead to his. "You shouldn't have come after me." He smiled again, faint and crooked. Didn't know how not to. Outside the wind changed. The storm that had haunted them for days began to die. In its place came a quiet that felt almost holy. Mara sat beside him, fingers tracing the line of his hand. "You saved me," she said softly. "Maybe we saved each other," he answered. She leaned close, her breath mingling with his. "Rest. I'll keep watch." But he shook his head. "No. We'll watch together." The fire crackled. For the first time in what felt like years, Elias didn't see ghosts when he closed his eyes. Only the flicker of flame, the curve of Mara's face, the sound of her heartbeat steady and alive beside him. Outside, far up the mountain, the mouth of the Devil's Hollow glowed faintly red against the snow before going dark forever. And inside the cabin, where blood and fire had mingled, two broken souls found what the wilderness had long denied them, not safety, not certainty, but the fragile unspoken truth that love can survive even the wild. Part 5. The Light of Dawn. Morning crept gently across the prairie, soft and pale, as though the world itself was afraid to wake. Smoke rose from the chimney of the little cabin, curling blue into the frozen air. The snow had settled smooth again, unbroken except for the path of footprints that led from the door to the woodpile and back. Inside, the fire hummed low, steady, and alive. Mara moved quietly through the room, the hem of her skirt brushing the floor. Her hands smelled of herbs and smoke. On the table beside the bed, she had laid a bowl of hot water, clean bandages, a folded cloth. The man on the bed hadn't stirred in 2 days. Sometimes his breathing faltered, and she'd press her ear to his chest, waiting for the slow, stubborn beat that meant he was still with her. She'd lost track of time. The days blurred into one another, gray mornings, long silences. nights spent listening to the wind drag its fingers over the walls. But she never left his side. Each dawn she lit the fire anew, brewed coffee, the way he'd once shown her, and told him stories as though he could hear them. Stories of places she barely remembered, of sunlight through glass of laughter before the world had teeth. Sometimes she thought he did hear her. Once when she spoke his name, his lips moved faintly, almost forming hers. On the third morning the storm broke. The sky cleared to a pale blue, and the air tasted of pine and thawing earth. Mara stepped outside, wrapping herself in Elias's old coat. The snow glittered like crushed glass under the rising sun. For the first time since the cave, she could breathe without feeling watched. But even then, far beyond the hills, she thought she saw a shadow move, tall, slow, half hidden by mist. She blinked, and it was gone. When she returned inside, Elias was awake. He didn't move at first, just lay there, eyes open, watching the smoke trace patterns above him. His face was drawn and pale, the color of ash, but when he saw her, something flickered behind his gaze. Recognition, disbelief, gratitude. "Mornin'," she whispered, voice trembling. He tried to answer, but the sound came out as a rasp. She brought him water, lifting his head carefully. He drank, coughed once, then smiled, a weak, cracked smile, but real. "Guess I ain't dead yet," he said. Mara laughed softly, a sound that broke and mended at the same time. "You almost were." He looked around the room, the bandages across his chest, the gentle order she'd brought to the chaos. "You did all this," she nodded. "Couldn't lose you after all that noise you made." He chuckled, a low, broken thing that ended in a wince. "You shouldn't have stayed. Could have gone south, found the road, found people." Her eyes softened. "And leave you here. You pulled me out of that cave, Elias. You gave me back my breath. I wasn't about to walk away while you were still fighting for yours." He stared at her for a long moment, the words caught behind his teeth. Then he looked toward the window, where sunlight spilled through the frost. "How long's it been? 3 days since we came back?" 3. He exhaled, and it hasn't shown itself. She shook her head. "No, only the wind." He closed his eyes, sinking back into the pillow. Maybe that's enough. The next few days passed like slow-moving water. Elias grew stronger, sitting up by the fire to mend his gear, though Mara scolded him for it. She cooked what little they had left, cornmeal, dried beans, jerky softened in broth, and forced him to eat. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. The silence between them was no longer empty. It felt like something shared. Outside, winter began to ease its grip. Icicles melted, dripping from the roof with soft notes, like a clock counting down to spring. Each morning Mara opened the door to let the light in. Elias would watch her from his chair, her hair catching the sun, and think how easily she belonged to the landscape, wild, scarred, and beautiful. One morning she found him standing at the stove, stirring the pot. "You shouldn't be up," she said. He grinned, figured I could at least make coffee. The smell filled the room, rich, bitter, comforting. He poured 2 cups and handed her one. Their fingers brushed. The warmth between them was more than the fire's doing. She sat across from him, cupping the mug in both hands. "Feels strange," she said after a while. "Quiet, I mean." "Quiet's a gift," he answered. "You only notice it once you've had too much noise." She nodded, gazing into the flames. "I used to think quiet meant I was alone." "It used to mean that for me, too." Their eyes met, and the air seemed to hold still. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the shutters, but inside time slowed to the rhythm of the fire. The silence that followed wasn't empty at all. It was full of everything they couldn't say. Later, when he went outside to gather wood, Mara watched him from the doorway. His movements were slower than before, careful, but his shoulders were steady. The sight filled her with something she hadn't felt in years: peace. That night they shared the last of the beans and laughed over nothing, the kind of laughter that comes from exhaustion and relief. When the fire burned low, Elias leaned back, looking at her through the dim light. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked. Sometimes she admitted. Then I remember there's nowhere else that knows my name. He nodded, eyes soft. Could rebuild the barn come spring. Fix the fence line. Might be room for two in this life after all. She smiled. You planning on keeping me here, Mr. Gray? Only if you plan on staying. Her answer was a whisper I already have. Outside, the moon rose clear and full. Somewhere far off, a coyote sang a lonely, hopeful sound. The world felt wider than it had in years. When dawn came again, the sky blushed pink over the plains. Elias woke to the smell of coffee. For a moment he thought it was a dream, the kind he used to have before the nightmares came. Then he opened his eyes and saw Mara by the stove, her hair catching the light, her face peaceful. Something inside him broke quietly in the best way. The sight of her there, alive, smiling, tending the fire, was something he hadn't dared to imagine he'd ever see again. The sound of the pot bubbling, the smell of earth and warmth, it was ordinary, and because of that, it was sacred. She noticed him watching. What she asked, smiling. Nothing, he said softly. Just didn't think I'd see another morning like this. She crossed to him, placing a cup in his hand. Then don't waste it, she said. He nodded, taking a sip. The taste was bitter and perfect. Outside, the horizon glowed gold, melting the frost from the grass. In the far distance, where the forest met the sky, something moved, just a shimmer of motion, too far to name. Two yellow eyes glinted once through the mist, then vanished. Elias watched a moment longer, then turned back to the warmth of the cabin. Let it watch, he said quietly. We've got work to do. Mara smiled. We reckon so, he said, and set his cup down. The ranch needs mending. So do we. They spent the day together side by side, repairing what winter had broken, mending fences, clearing snow from the roof. The sun rose higher, spilling light across the valley. Each small act became a kind of prayer, hammering laughter, the touch of hands passing tools, the warmth of shared breath in the cold. By evening, the cabin looked less like a refuge and more like a home. The walls seemed to hold the echo of their voices. When the stars came out, they stood outside in the chill, looking over the plains. Mara leaned her head on his shoulder. Do you think it's really gone? She asked. Elias looked toward the mountains, their peaks fading into the night. Things like that don't just disappear, he said. But maybe they know when to stop haunting. She was quiet a moment, then whispered, And us? He smiled faintly. Maybe we're learning the same. They went inside the door, closing softly behind them. The fire caught again, crackling, spreading its glow through the small space. Elias hung his hat on the wall and sat beside her. The warmth filled the room, steady and slow like a heartbeat. Outside, the last of the snow began to melt. Streams trickled down the hillsides, carrying winter away. The land breathed again, and in that breath between loss and renewal, two souls who had walked through darkness found a fragile kind of peace. Elias reached for her hand, rough fingers closing gently around hers. You know, he said quietly, the thing about the West, it takes everything from you till all that's left is what matters most. She looked at him, eyes bright. And what's that? He smiled, small and certain. Someone to come home to. The fire popped, sending a spark up the chimney. Outside, dawn stretched higher, spilling gold across the snow. And for the first time in years, the light didn't hurt his eyes. He turned to Mara, his voice low, steady, and full of the quiet truth that had been growing inside him since the day he found her in the snow. We made it, Mara, he said. Whatever comes next. We made it. She squeezed his hand. Yes, she whispered. We did. The wind shifted soft as a sigh, carrying the scent of pine and smoke across the valley. The mountains stood silent, watching. And in the heart of the Wild West, beneath a sky reborn, love kept its small fire burning steady, defiant, and alive. The sun was slipping low across the plains, turning the snow to gold. Long shadows stretched from the fence posts, and the light caught in the grass where winter was finally giving up its hold. The world looked softer now, tamed, as if the land itself had decided to rest. Elias sat on the old wooden fence, one boot hooked over the lower rail, the other resting in the dust. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, though the fading light glimmered off the silver in his beard. Beside him, Mara leaned back, her hands folded in her lap, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The air smelled of wood smoke and sage. They had finished the last of the spring repairs that morning. The fence was mended. The barn no longer leaned under the weight of the snow. The fields stretched quiet, untouched, except for the faint prints of rabbits and deer. The cabin chimney sent up a thin, lazy thread of smoke rising into the sunset. Neither spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything that had brought them here, the nights of fear, the mornings of doubt, the slow healing that came after. Somewhere in the far distance, the wind began to stir. It came down from the mountains, carrying with it the scent of pine and thawed earth, and a low sound that could have been the groan of the forest or the echo of something larger. Mara lifted her head, listening. "If it comes back," she began, her voice almost a whisper, "what will we do?" Elias turned to her, the corners of his mouth lifting in a quiet smile. "We won't hide," he said. "Can't spend a life looking over our shoulders. The West already took too much from me. I'm done letting it take what's left." She watched him for a moment, her eyes catching the fading light, and in them he saw everything he'd thought the world had stolen: warmth, courage, something like faith. She reached out and laid her hand over his. His fingers closed around hers, rough against soft. The wind shifted, brushing across their faces, lifting her hair. Far away from deep within the mountains came a faint rumble, a growl maybe, or just the earth settling into sleep. Elias looked toward the ridge where the cave lay, hidden, its mouth sealed with ice and time. "Let it stay there," he murmured. "Let the mountain keep its secrets." Mara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think it remembers us?" He chuckled softly. "Reckon the wilderness don't forget much. But neither do we." They sat together, the sky fading from gold to rose to deep indigo. A flock of birds crossed the horizon, their wings catching the last light before disappearing into shadow. The air cooled. The first stars began to show, scattered like sparks above the endless stretch of land. Elias pulled the shawl tighter around her, his arm still resting along the fence rail behind her shoulders. "Never thought I'd see a night like this again," he said quietly. "Peaceful. Still." She smiled. "You earned it." He shook his head. "We both did." The prairie wind moved again, soft and steady, whispering through the tall grass. It carried the scent of the distant river, the promise of spring, and something else. Something human. Forgiveness, maybe. Or simply the kind of calm that comes when two souls have fought their last fight. For a while, the only sound was the creak of the fence and the wind sighing low. The world had turned gentle, as if it too understood that the time for pain had passed. When the last light of day sank behind the ridge, Elias reached up and took off his hat. He set it on his knee, staring at the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a thin band of fading fire. "You know," he said after a while, "when I first came out here, I thought this land was punishment. Empty, hard, endless. But maybe it's just honest. It gives you back exactly what you bring to it." Mara looked at him, her face lit by the afterglow. "And what did you bring to it?" He smiled, slow and quiet. "Grief, for a long time." But now he looked down at her hand, still in his. "Now I think I've got something better to give it." She rested her head against him, her voice soft. "What's that, love?" he said simply. For a moment neither spoke. The words seemed to linger in the air, as fragile as the light itself. Mara's eyes shimmered, and she squeezed his hand, her breath catching. Around them the prairie breathed. The wind quieted, and even the long grass stilled. "Elias," she whispered, "I'm glad you came for me." He smiled again, a deep, unguarded smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "I reckon you came for me too." The first chill of evening crept in. They sat there until the sky turned black and the stars burned clear and sharp above the valley. Every so often, the wind returned soft as a sigh wrapping around them like a promise. And far off, almost too faint to hear, came one last echo from the mountains. Not a roar this time, but something gentler, older, fading into silence. Whatever lived out there was still watching, still remembering, but it no longer owned their fear. Elias breathed deep, the air cool and sweet. "Funny thing about the West," he said. "You can lose everything out here, but somehow it still gives you a reason to keep going." Mara nodded. "Because it teaches you what matters." He glanced at her. "And what's that?" She smiled through the dusk. "Love and kindness. They're the only things that stay warm when the fire dies." He nodded slowly. "Reckon you're right." The wind rose one final time, carrying their laughter across the plain. It moved through the tall grass, through the broken fences, over the hills, and up toward the sleeping mountains. The sound mingled with the hush of the coming night, a song of survival, and something softer, something like peace. Elias looked out over the horizon one last time, his arm still around Mara, the world stretching endless and wide before them. "This place," he said softly, almost to himself, "it'll outlast us all. But for now, it's ours." She nodded her head, resting against his shoulder, and together they watched the sun sink completely below the earth. Darkness folded around them, but it wasn't the darkness of fear anymore. It was the kind that holds warmth inside it, the kind that comes after a fire burns low and steady. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the echo of the wind answered itself low and steady, like a heart beating in the distance. The night closed in gentle, and the cabin light, small as a candle in the wilderness, glowed on its smoke curling into the stars. Inside that light, two souls who had wandered through terror and loss found their way home, not to walls and wood, but to one another. And if the wind ever carried the memory of their names across the prairie, it did so softly, the way the earth remembers kindness long after footprints fade. Out here in the Wild West, where the nights are long and the winters unforgiving, only love and kindness can keep a heart warm. And maybe, just maybe, that's all the world's ever needed. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and rate it from 0 to 10. Subscribe for more Wild West bedtime tales where every sunset holds another story.